It was a quiet winter evening, and the town lay still under a blanket of snow. The streetlights cast long shadows on the icy roads as John Foster drove home from his store. His car hummed steadily along the familiar path through the downtown area. The chill of the night was sharp even inside the warmth of his car. He had been running errands all day and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The roads were slick from an earlier snowfall, and John kept his eyes on the road. As he made a slow turn at a corner, his headlights cutting through the dark, the sound of the tires against the wet pavement was the only noise until suddenly he saw the flashing lights behind him. For a moment, John wondered if he had done something wrong. Was he speeding, or had he missed a stop sign? But he quickly dismissed the thought as his speed was well within the limit. He pulled over to the side of the road and put the car in park. Turning the engine off, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights flashed in red and blue, illuminating the otherwise dark street. He didn't recognize the patrol car, but that wasn't unusual for a small town like this. New officers would sometimes drive through just to keep an eye on things. Still, it was strange to be stopped when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. A man in a police uniform approached his window, and John rolled it down, giving the officer a polite nod. As he did, the officer didn't smile or greet him in any way. His face was set in a stern expression, and his posture was rigid. John felt a small knot form in his stomach, wondering if something was wrong with his paperwork or if there was a mistake of some kind. "License and registration," the officer said without any introduction, his voice flat and businesslike. John felt the tension in the air. Immediately, though he hadn't done anything wrong, he complied without hesitation, reaching into the glove compartment and pulling out the necessary documents. He handed them over. As instructed, the officer barely glanced at them before handing them back and nodding for him to step out of the vehicle. John hesitated for a brief moment, not sure why he was being asked to get out, but the officer's expression didn't change. And so John opened the door and stepped out into the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air. The officer motioned for him to stand by the patrol car, and John did, as instructed, his mind racing for any possible explanation for the stop. The officer seemed to take a moment, sizing him up, and John began to feel an unsettling sense of unease growing in his chest. This wasn't the usual polite exchange he had experienced with law enforcement in the past. There was something more rigid about this encounter, something that felt wrong. The officer's eyes never left John's face, and for a moment it felt like the air between them had thickened into something heavier than it should have been. After a long pause, the officer finally spoke, his tone not changing, but his words caught John completely off guard. "Do push-ups," the officer ordered with a sharpness that didn't allow room for question. John blinked in confusion, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. "Excuse me," he asked, feeling his heart rate quicken. The officer simply nodded towards the ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "I said do push-ups now," he repeated. John stood frozen for a moment, his breath puffing in visible clouds around him as the words echoed in his mind. The chill of the night air seemed to settle into his bones as he processed what the officer had said. "Do push-ups?" he muttered under his breath, almost as if trying to convince himself he had misunderstood. The officer, however, didn't soften his stance. His gaze remained unwavering, the authority in his voice clear as day. There was no mistaking it. "Yes, do push-ups now," he insisted, the icy air around them seemed to grow colder with each word. John glanced around, his mind racing. The streets were empty. No one was watching, no witnesses, no passerby who could help him make sense of what was happening. It felt surreal, as though he had stepped into a strange dream where nothing made sense. But the officer was real. His commanding posture was real, and the harshness in his voice left no room for doubt or negotiation. "Why?" John finally managed to ask, his voice edged with confusion and disbelief. "Why do you want me to do push-ups? What's this about?" He tried to keep his tone calm, but it wasn't easy. His heart was pounding, a sense of frustration and humiliation beginning to settle in. He wasn't even sure what he had done wrong, much less why he was being treated this way. The officer's expression didn't change. His eyes remained cold, unreadable. "You've been disrespectful. Now do the push-ups," he commanded, his voice never rising but carrying a quiet menace that sent a shiver down John's spine. "You've got 10 seconds before I decide what happens next." John's mind raced. This couldn't be real. Surely this wasn't how things were supposed to go during a simple traffic stop. His instincts told him to protest, to argue, to demand an explanation. But deep down, he knew he was at a disadvantage. It was just him and the officer in the freezing night, and the officer held all the power. John couldn't risk escalating the situation any further. Reluctantly, he lowered himself to the ground, his hands sinking into the ice-cold pavement. His fingers tingled as the freezing surface bit into his skin, and the biting wind didn't help. It wasn't just the cold that was unbearable, it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. The humiliation gnawed at him as he got into position, looking up only to see the officer standing there, arms crossed, waiting for him to begin. "Start now," the officer ordered, and without a moment's hesitation, John pushed his body up and down, feeling every inch of the frozen concrete beneath him. His body protested immediately, the cold working its way into his muscles, making each push harder than the last. His arms burned, his chest tightened with the effort, but the officer stood motionless, as if this was just a routine part of his job. Every push-up felt like it was draining something out of him, his energy, his pride, his sense of dignity. John's breath came in short gasps, the icy air stinging his lungs with every inhale. The officer didn't even flinch, his eyes locked onto John with a cold intensity. The longer John pushed himself to continue, the more he realized how hopeless this situation felt. There was no reason behind this exercise, no justification. It was just an abuse of power, plain and simple. When he reached 20 push-ups, the officer didn't say a word. Instead, he simply nodded, signaling for him to keep going. The burn in John's arms intensified, but there was no escape. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself to finish, each movement slower than the last. There was a moment when he wanted to stop, to collapse in protest, but he knew better than to challenge the officer further. He wasn't sure what would happen if he did. Would the officer make it worse? Would he escalate the situation? The uncertainty gnawed at him as much as the physical pain. The cold was unbearable. John's hands were numb, his arms burning with each painful push-up. The icy ground scraped against his palms, and every movement sent a shock of cold through his body. His breath came out in ragged gasps, the frost settling on his face, his cheeks flushed from the exertion and the biting wind. The world around him seemed to blur, the streetlights dimming as he focused only on the burning muscles in his arms and the officer's cold, unwavering stare. He had lost track of how many push-ups he had done. 20, 30, 40? It didn't matter. Each time he pushed himself up, he could feel his body protesting, his chest tightening, his legs quivering with fatigue. The officer stood there like a statue, unmoving, unblinking, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to ask of someone. There were no words of encouragement, no acknowledgement of his effort, just silence, punctuated only by the sound of John's labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath him. John tried to focus on something, anything to take his mind off the pain. He thought of his business, of the shop he had worked so hard to build, of the family and friends he would soon return to. But each time he pushed up, the officer's face appeared in his mind again. The officer wasn't just an authority figure anymore. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with this encounter. He was the one who wielded power recklessly, taking advantage of it in the most bizarre and humiliating way. More, the officer's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. It wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a question, it was a command. John hesitated for a split second, his arms quivering, his breath shallow. But the officer's presence was too heavy, too overpowering. He had no choice but to continue. His body felt like it was shutting down, but somehow he found the strength to keep going. One more push-up, one more, and then one more after that. But with each push, his strength was draining. His arms felt like lead, his entire body seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. The world around him seemed to spin, the wind cutting through him like daggers, the ground unyielding beneath him. The officer didn't move an inch. He just stood there, waiting for John to complete the impossible task he had set. It was as if he was enjoying it, taking some twisted satisfaction in watching John struggle, in watching him break down little by little. By the time John reached 50 push-ups, he couldn't feel his hands. His arms were numb, his muscles screaming for release, but the officer's voice rang in his ears, relentless. "You're almost done," the officer said, but there was no encouragement in his tone, only cold indifference. "Just a few more." John's mind was starting to unravel. The cold wasn't just physical anymore. It was creeping into his thoughts, clouding his judgment. He had never experienced anything like this. There was no reason behind it, no logic. His body ached beyond belief, his chest tight from the exertion and the cold. And still, the officer stood there, waiting for more. 50 isn't enough, the officer said, his tone final. "Keep going." Another 20. The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He was barely holding it together, but the officer's voice, calm and demanding, left no room for refusal. Desperation flooded through him. He had no idea how much longer he could continue. His body was on the verge of collapse, and yet he had no choice but to keep going. John's entire body screamed in protest. His arms were numb, his chest was tight, and his legs wobbled with each push-up. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, making it harder to focus on anything but the relentless demand for more. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, the icy air burning his lungs with every inhale. The world around him seemed to blur in a haze of pain and exhaustion. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. The officer stood over him like a shadow, his expression unreadable, waiting for John to obey. 20 more. The officer's voice sliced through the air like a blade. His words were a command, and John knew there was no room for negotiation. He could feel his body starting to betray him. His arms were like lead, and every time he pushed himself up, his chest felt tighter, as if the air itself was growing colder, harder to breathe. His thoughts started to scatter. He tried to remind himself that this was temporary, that it would eventually end. But the pain was becoming unbearable. He had done enough push-ups for any reasonable person, yet the officer didn't seem to care. There was no mercy in his voice, no recognition of John's struggle. He was just a pawn in this twisted game, a man at the mercy of someone who had all the power. Each time his hands slammed into the cold ground, he felt the harshness of the pavement beneath him. The rough concrete scraped against his palms, sending jolts of pain through his body. His mind screamed for him to stop, to just lie down and surrender to the agony, but something kept him going. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was sheer survival instinct. But whatever it was, it pushed him to keep moving, to keep forcing his arms to lift his body off the freezing ground. "Don't stop," the officer growled, his words cutting through the fog in John's mind. "You've got 10 more. Keep going." John couldn't fathom how he was supposed to finish this. His body was on the edge of collapse. His arms burned so intensely that he could barely feel them anymore. Every muscle in his body seemed to be screaming, pleading for relief. But there was no relief. The officer's cold, emotionless presence hovered over him, unyielding and unwavering. With each push-up, it felt like John was sinking deeper into the freezing ground, like he was disappearing beneath the weight of the officer's demands. His vision began to blur, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. His breath was shallow, and he could taste the bitter cold in his throat. But he knew that stopping wasn't an option. The officer would not let him stop. The officer had made that clear from the start. John's thoughts drifted to his family. He thought of his wife, his children, his friends. They were waiting for him to come home. They had no idea what was happening right now, but he couldn't let them down. He couldn't let this officer, this random abuse of power, break him. He had to finish, even if it meant crawling through the rest of these push-ups. He forced his body to push up one more time, and then again and again. The officer didn't say a word, just watched as John struggled through the last few push-ups. Each one felt like a mountain, each movement a fight against his own body, his own limits. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John collapsed onto the cold ground, his arms giving way beneath him. His entire body shook with exhaustion, his breath coming in desperate gasps. He didn't have the strength to get up. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, the world spinning around him. But the officer's gaze was still there, still watching, still expecting more. John lay on the freezing pavement, his body trembling with exhaustion, his breath shallow and labored. He could feel the raw scrape of his skin against the cold ground where his hands had just been, his muscles screaming in protest as if they had reached their breaking point. But the officer didn't seem to care. He stood above John, his cold eyes watching without sympathy, waiting for him to get back up. For a brief moment, John thought he might pass out right there on the ice. His body had simply had enough. But the officer's presence, unyielding and domineering, kept him from losing control entirely. John tried to push himself up, but his arms refused to cooperate. He was too weak, too drained from the brutal exercise. His muscles ached with the kind of deep, gnawing pain that only comes from extreme exhaustion. Every nerve in his body screamed for relief, but there was none to be found. He struggled to breathe, his chest tight, his breath coming in short gasps. The officer stood there, silent and imposing, as if this was just another part of his routine, another insignificant moment in his day. There was no kindness in his eyes, no sign of compassion for the man who had just been forced to endure more physical strain than most people could handle. The cold air bit at John's exposed skin, but it wasn't just the weather that was numbing him. It was the realization of what had just happened. He had been humiliated, reduced to nothing more than an object of amusement for this officer. With great effort, John finally managed to push himself up to his hands and knees. His arms shook with the effort, and his entire body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. He looked up at the officer, his eyes wild with a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had done what was asked of him. No, he had done more than that. He had pushed his body beyond its limits, and still, the officer wasn't satisfied. "Get up," the officer said flatly, his tone like ice. "You're not done." John's stomach churned with frustration. The anger inside him was rising, a slow-burning fire that he had been trying to suppress. He had tried to comply. He had tried to endure the humiliation, but now, standing on his hands and knees in the snow, he couldn't take it anymore. He felt like a prisoner, trapped in a situation where the rules kept changing, where nothing he did would ever be enough. But John wasn't the type to back down. Not now, not when it mattered most. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this officer control him any longer. He wasn't going to let this twisted power trip continue. He had had enough. With great effort, John stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. He faced the officer, his mind clouded with a mixture of anger and disbelief, but his resolve was clear. He wasn't going to give in, not anymore. The officer was watching him, waiting for him to make a move, but John wasn't going to comply any longer. The officer took a step forward, his posture still rigid, as if expecting John to fall back into line. But John held his ground, the anger coursing through him now, giving him the strength to face this moment. He had never felt so small and insignificant, but something inside him pushed back against that feeling. He wouldn't let this man break him. John looked the officer squarely in the eye and spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. "No more. I've had enough. You don't get to do this." For a split second, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the officer's gaze. Maybe it was surprise. Maybe it was something else. But it didn't matter. John had made his decision. And this moment, this confrontation, was far from over. The officer paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied John. For a brief second, there was a shift in the air, a tension that thickened between them. John's chest was still heaving from the physical strain, but his mind was clearer now. He had made a choice. No more would he be treated like a puppet on a string, humiliated for reasons he couldn't understand. His legs were shaky, his body still trembling, but there was something in him that refused to back down now. The officer's lips tightened into a thin line. It was almost as if John had just defied an unwritten rule, a line that should never have been crossed. The officer's hands rested at his sides, but the tension in his posture suggested he was deciding his next move. He wasn't used to being challenged. Most people complied without question, their fear outweighing their sense of self-preservation. But John wasn't like most people. He wasn't afraid to stand up for himself, even if it meant facing a man in uniform who held all the power. "You think you can just refuse orders?" the officer asked, his voice icy and sharp. It wasn't a question, it was a threat, a warning. But the words didn't faze John. He stood tall, staring back at the officer, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. "I've done everything you asked," John said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You've pushed me past my limits. I'm done. You don't get to keep humiliating me." For a moment, the officer didn't respond. His expression remained impassive, as though he was weighing his options, trying to figure out what to do next. John could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger still burning in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the physical pain anymore, it was the injustice, the abuse of power that made his blood boil. He wasn't just some random person the officer could push around for sport. He had a life, a family, a future. And none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was his dignity, his self-respect. The officer stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, but John didn't flinch. He stood his ground, staring directly into the officer's eyes. If the officer was expecting him to back down, he was sorely mistaken. John was done being afraid. He wasn't going to let this man take control of his life any longer. The officer's face twisted into something between a scowl and a sneer. "You're making a big mistake, buddy," he growled, his voice low and threatening. The words had a bite to them, but they didn't have the power to intimidate John. The officer could do whatever he wanted, but it wouldn't break John's resolve. "I don't care," John replied firmly. "I've had enough of this, and you can't scare me anymore." For the first time during the entire encounter, the officer's cool demeanor faltered. His eyes flickered with a brief flash of uncertainty, as though he didn't quite know how to respond. John's words had struck a nerve. He wasn't just dealing with a man who was following orders anymore. He was dealing with someone who had broken free of the control, someone who wasn't going to take it anymore. The officer stood motionless for a moment longer, his jaw clenched. The silence between them stretched on, and in that silence, something shifted. The power dynamic that had been so firmly in the officer's hands began to crumble. John wasn't backing down, and in that instant, the officer seemed to realize that no amount of intimidation or force would change that. Finally, the officer let out a frustrated sigh, his shoulders sagging slightly as he took a step back. "Fine," he muttered. His voice was cold, but there was no further demand for push-ups, no more commands. It was a small victory, but it was enough. John had stood his ground. "Get out of here," the officer spat, his tone filled with disdain. "Don't think I won't remember this." John didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He turned on his heel and walked away, each step still shaky from the ordeal, but with his head held high. He had survived. He had fought back, and he had won. As he got back into his car and slammed the door shut, John's mind raced. He had been through something brutal, something he would never forget. But he had made it through. And as he drove away, the officer's figure fading in the rearview mirror, John felt a surge of relief mixed with the realization that things weren't over yet. There would be consequences. But for now, he was free. As John drove away from the scene, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the tension. The weight of what had just happened settled on him slowly, as though the adrenaline had worn off, leaving him with a cold, simmering anger. His heart was still racing, his breath still uneven, but there was also a quiet sense of triumph that began to grow within him. He had stood his ground. He had not let the officer break him, and for the first time in a long while, John felt like he had reclaimed a piece of himself. The streets outside his car blurred past, the night sky stretching wide above him. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the otherwise still world around him. He had been through something extraordinary, something that would have shaken most people to their core. But instead of fear, instead of defeat, John felt a fire burning inside him. The confrontation was far from over. It was only just beginning. When John got home, The silence of his empty house was almost suffocating. He walked in, his jacket still on, his body aching, but his mind racing. His wife, Emily, was usually in bed by this time, and the kids were asleep. But tonight, something was different. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't go to bed, act like nothing had happened, like everything was normal. He had to do something about it. He paced around the living room, trying to calm himself down. He knew he couldn't just forget about the abuse of power he had endured. The officer had humiliated him for no reason. He had pushed him to his limits and beyond. But the more John thought about it, the more he realized that what had happened wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his humiliation. It was about the bigger picture. It was about standing up against the very system that allowed people like that officer to treat others with cruelty and disrespect. John grabbed his phone and stared at it for a moment. He knew what he needed to do. The officer's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. It wasn't the first time someone had abused their power, and it wouldn't be the last. But if no one spoke out, if no one stood up against it, nothing would ever change. He opened his contacts, scrolling until he found the number he needed. It was time to take action. He couldn't just let this go, couldn't just accept it as some random, unfortunate experience. He dialed the number, his thumb hovering over the green button for a moment before pressing it. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "Hello, this is Sergeant Miller. How can I help you?" John took a deep breath. His voice was steady, but there was a determination in it that made his words sharper than he intended. "I need to file a complaint. A serious one. About an officer who just—" He hesitated for a moment. "Abused his authority. He made me do push-ups in freezing weather, and when I refused, he didn't stop. It was humiliating. It was unnecessary, and I want something done about it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that made John uneasy. He could almost hear the wheels turning in Sergeant Miller's mind. But when the voice finally spoke again, it was calm, professional, but with a hint of skepticism. "Are you sure about this? I mean, this sounds extreme," Sergeant Miller said slowly. "We'll need to investigate, but you'll need to provide more details." John exhaled sharply, his mind still racing. He hadn't expected this to be easy. But there was no turning back now. "I'll give you everything you need. I'm not making this up. You need to know what happened." The conversation stretched on, details of the incident being recorded, John's frustration growing with each passing minute. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference, if anything would change. But as he spoke, something inside him solidified, a determination to see this through, to make sure that officer faced consequences for what he had done. When the call ended, John sank back into the couch, exhausted, both physically and mentally. But as his eyes closed, he realized that this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be long, and there were no guarantees. But he had started something, and that was enough for now. Days passed since John filed the complaint. Each day felt like an eternity. He went about his routine, trying to focus on work, on his family, but every spare moment was consumed by thoughts of what had happened, of what he had set in motion. His phone remained silent, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions, though righteous, had set off a storm that he couldn't control. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had to believe that, but the nagging uncertainty gnawed at him. On the fourth day, just as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, his phone rang. The unfamiliar number flashed on the screen, and John's heart skipped a beat. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice tentative. "Mr. Anderson." The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative. "This is Officer Miller. I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed last week." John sat up straighter. He had been waiting for this call, dreading it and yet craving it at the same time. He braced himself. "Yes," John replied, his voice steady. "What's the update?" "We've investigated the matter thoroughly," Officer Miller said. "We've reviewed the footage from the body camera of the officer in question and spoken to witnesses. We've also spoken to the officer himself." John's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. The officer's actions were inappropriate and contrary to department policy. Officer Miller continued. He has been placed on administrative leave while the department conducts further internal review. Additionally, we are offering an apology for the treatment you endured. I understand that this situation was difficult, and we regret the pain it caused. John exhaled sharply, the tension in his body slowly dissipating as the words sank in. It wasn't the full justice he had hoped for, but it was something. The officer wouldn't get away with what he had done, and John's decision to speak out had set a chain of events into motion that could prevent this from happening again. I appreciate the investigation, John said, his voice thick with emotion. But what happens next? Will there be consequences for the officer? Officer Miller's voice softened, as if he understood the weight of John's question. That's still under review. We can't go into specifics yet, but I want you to know that the department takes these matters seriously. There will be consequences, and we will keep you updated. John nodded, his thoughts spinning. The truth was, he wasn't sure what the officer's fate would be. He wasn't sure how far this would go. But knowing that the system was at least acknowledging the wrongness of the situation gave him some comfort. Thank you, John said, his voice quieter now. I just want to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. You're doing the right thing, Mr. Anderson, Officer Miller replied. We'll be in touch with further updates. The call ended, and John sat back, the weight of it all hitting him. He had won a small victory, but the fight wasn't over. He knew that. The officer might face consequences, but the fight for justice, for accountability, would continue. John couldn't rest until he knew that this wasn't a one-off event, that this officer's behavior wouldn't be overlooked or swept under the rug. As the days stretched into weeks, John began to notice a shift. People who had heard about his ordeal, from friends to strangers, began to approach him. Some were supportive, some were skeptical, but the conversation had started. His decision to speak out had sparked a dialogue about the abuse of power and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. He had become a symbol for standing up against injustice, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. In the end, John knew that real change was a slow process, and there was still work to be done. But as he looked at his reflection in the mirror one evening, he saw a man who had refused to be broken. He had fought for his dignity, and in doing so, he had given others the courage to fight for theirs too. He had done what he set out to do, not just for himself, but for the greater good. And for the first time in a long time, John felt peace.